Welcome to Karibu on Kaya FM 95.9. Now, this weekend, the city of Joburg played host to the prestigious African Women Writers Symposium. The gathering, now in its third year, was attended by some of the world's and South Africa's most influential writers and artists. Among the artistic luminaries present were world-acclaimed authoress Sapphire and the iconic, multi-talented poet and musician Linton Kwesi Johnson. Welcome to Karibu, Linton.
Good afternoon.
Now, you've been to South Africa before?
Yes, several times.
Several times. And
I've been coming here since the 90s.
And you've been observing the evolution of the society?
Not very closely, but yes, I have made some observations.
And those are briefly? What are those observations?
Well,
the change that is happening?
The same kind of observations that people outside of South Africa get from the news media, you know, the end of apartheid, the predominance of the ANC government, the change of leadership from Mandela to Mbeki to Joseph Zuma, the Marikana massacre, and the fact that South Africa hosted the World Cup football match, you know. So I'm just as informed as any member of the general public outside of South Africa.
Artists tend to be very brutal in their assessment of situations.
Well, I'm not here to pass judgment on. I'm not here to pass judgment on South Africa. I'm a guest. Here in this
you're
country,
a guest.
So I'm not here to criticize or to condemn.
Let us talk about your visit this time round. You attended the African Women Writers Symposium, but part of the symposium this time round was to celebrate the life of Jayne Cortez, who of course some of our listeners might not know who she was. She's an American author, written about 12 books of poems. She was a performer of poetry, music-wise. She's got 9 recordings, and her work was presented all over the world, really. And translated, into quite a number of languages. So she's quite iconic in her. She was iconic in her own right, and she was a friend of yours.
Yes, I'm very privileged to have known her.
Yes,
and we had a lot of great times together on the stage. In all over the place, in Barcelona, in Paris, in London, in New York, in Dakar. She was I would say she was a unique voice in American poetry, because I say unique, although she belonged to the African American tradition of the spoken word combined with music, the jazz tradition, the blues tradition, if you like.
Yes,
with people like Amiri Baraka and Ted Jones. Coming out of the school, the tradition of Langston Hughes, she also brought another dimension to her work, which was the influence of the poets of negritude, like Aimé Césaire from Martinique, and Senghor, Leopold Senghor from Senegal, and Dumas from the Guyanas, which gave a kind of a surrealistic dimension to this jazz poetry and blues poetry that she wrote.
Yes. And of course, she was one of the founders of the African Women Writers Organization.
Well, I don't know a lot about that. I'm just a honorary man.
Yes. Yes, I think it's called she was the president of the Organization of Women Writers of Africa. Now, her life. It was being celebrated in the conference. What would you say is her significance among artists of African descent in the diaspora?
I would say her significance was that not only was she a powerful African American woman who was a pioneer of the Black Arts movement in the United States of America. She had an African consciousness. She made a connection between Africa and the African diaspora. And for her, that was very important. That was central to her perspective, her consciousness, her view of the world.
And your observation in terms of, I think in globally, women artists, have started to assert themselves, in so many different spheres. Do you feel that women artists are still being discriminated against? How far have we come in recognizing them in their own rights?
I think women have made significant progress over the last 20, 30 years. I remember 20 years ago, African American women's literature came to the fore, with people like Toni Morrison and the author of The Color Purple, Alice Walker,
yes.
and, writers like that. So, but these things seems to come in phases. Like, for a few years, African black women writers are prominent, and then all of a sudden, things quieten down a little bit. And it seemed as if the struggle to be heard, to have your voice heard, is a continuous one, not just for black women, for black male authors too.
Is it because of the message that they're trying to convey, or what could be the main hindrances?
Personally, I can't say, because one would have thought that voices would be promoted or heard on the basis of the merit of their work, rather than the themes or issues to do with race. But of course, I think those who control the media and the publishing houses, they're still in the same hands. And it's, I don't know, commercial considerations. And one cannot help but think that there is still this kind of racial dimension going on.
Yes.
And issues, of course, to do with gender. Race and gender are still important issues.
They're still a factor in how people. Now, but you've stayed the course. Like I was saying that. We used to listen to your music and poetry way back. When we were in high school. And you've stayed the course. I've stayed
the course because I've been independent. I've stayed the course because I was never, after 1982, I ceased to have signed to any record label. I started my own record company. And the reason why I've stayed the course is because of autonomy. I've managed my own affairs over the years, and I've not been beholden to anybody. I do my own thing on my own basis, based on my own criteria. And, I think that's a basic principle, Garveyite principle, the Marcus Garvey's principle of our black autonomy. I think that is what has guided my career throughout the years.
Yes. Your one of your songs is called Independent Intervention.
Absolutely.
Basically, that you can't rely on other people
to
do things.
I practice what I preach.
Yes. And you work in different areas. You work as a journalist, you work as a musician, but you also work as a poet. You and all of those activities seem to be activities of deep expression of ideas. You're operating in the realm of contestation of ideas. What drives you in that direction?
I guess what has motivated me has always been a strong conviction that we all belong to one human family, and that we need to do something to change the injustice that we see around us and that we experience, and that one of the main purpose of us being on earth is to try to change the world, to make it into a better place for everybody.
Yes. Now you're talking about on our program. We try and engage matters of the diaspora or of people of African descent. Now we are in South Africa, and we coming from a society that was closed off for a long time, for the longest time. And whenever we have someone visiting us, we try and get their perspective of what's happening globally. With the situation of people of African descent. How would you characterize that? And you travel the world. Do you find that there are similar problems, or do they tend to differ? For example, in the UK.
Excuse me. Well, we have some similarities in the UK with the United States of America, for example. Although I would imagine that the United States of America has more in common with South Africa, since both societies experienced apartheid. In fact, apartheid was invented in the United States of America and fine-tuned and perfected here in South Africa.
or presented in a crude way in South Africa,
right.
Whichever way one,
Right, but, there are some similarities, and it's always dangerous to draw historical parallels between different societies. But in for example, the campaign Black Lives Matter that is going on in the United States of America, which has captured the imaginations of people all over the world. We have similar struggles going on in England.
Yes.
Where the police seem to have a license to kill black people with impunity. In fact, the 2011 uprising and riots which happened in England, which happened in every major city, even in some of the suburbs of England, where there's nice white middle-class families, was sparked by the shooting, the assassination of a black guy called Mark Duggan, and that sparked the riots in Tottenham in London, and it spread throughout the country. Lozells Rodney, another black guy, was taken out by the police a couple of years before that. So, for the last 2 decades or more, we've been campaigning in Britain against black deaths in police custody. And there seems to be this culture of impunity, both sides of the Atlantic, in the British police force and in the police force in the United States of America. So in terms of the diaspora, that's one observation that I could make.
One of your songs is Making History, which you used to like as well. The role of the artist. How would you characterize it? Someone like yourself. Are you a leader? Are you a leader or a reflector?
No, I'm not. I don't know if one leads. I think one more reflects than leads. And there's, I always get a little bit nervous when it comes to questions about the role of the artist, because the role of the artist is to make good art. Basically, is to if you're a poet, is to write good poetry. If you're a musician, is to play good music. If you're a novelist, is to write great novels. If you're a dramatist, is to write great plays. That is the role of the artist at the end of the day, is to produce good art or great art that can touch a common human chord,
Irrespective of what the issue is.
Absolutely.
But your for example, our exposure to your music, etc., was very. It had a political context.
Well, that's because I came to poetry through politics. I discovered black literature and poetry and all of that as a consequence of being a political activist in my youth, joining the Black Panther movement, discovering that there was such a thing. Something called black literature, which from the school curriculum at the school in London that I attended, I didn't know existed. Most of my generation didn't know that black people wrote books, and it was a life-changing experience for me, discovering the works of writers like W.E.B. Du Bois who wrote The Souls of Black Folk, the Black Reconstruction in America, and so on. And Caribbean authors like C.L.R. James, who wrote The Black Jacobins, the history of the first successful slave revolt, which established the first independent black republic in 1804, which was 3 years before the slave trade was abolished. And, black people in the African diaspora owe a great debt to the people of Haiti. Haiti is one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere, but that's because they've been made to pay a great price for that historical transformation of the lot of black people by their successful revolution. But the success of the Haitian Revolution paved the way for the abolition of the slave trade and of slavery itself. So I came to poetry through my political activism and reading these books. Franz Fanon's book, Wretched of the Earth.
Yes.
These are the kind of books that I read.
A very famous book.
And these led me to the literature. And I discovered the poetry, African writers, African American writers, and Caribbean poets. So when I began to write, poetry for me was a cultural weapon in the black liberation struggle. And of course, as I wrote more and learned more, I discovered that poetry, there was a greater dimension to poetry than just being a cultural weapon. But nevertheless, it was an important dimension of poetry. And I, of course, eschewed the notion of art for art's sake, which is basically an aristocratic notion. So that's me.
Yes,
personally,
yes,
but
yes.
It doesn't have to be for every artist.
Okay.
Every writer comes to literature from a different way. Some writers, their parents were school teachers, and they grew up with a lot of books around them, and they just loved literature and they wanted to write. Nothing wrong with that.
And now, how did you get to bring music and poetry together?
I must have spoken about this a million times. It was to do with the language. Once I began to write in the Jamaican vernacular, the Jamaican language, and having been influenced by some of the reggae DJs in Jamaica in the 70s, like Big Youth and U Roy and Prince Jasbo and so on, I began to hear music in the actual speech. So over the years, what I've done is try to tease out an aesthetic which is based on combining the music, the natural musicality of language with the language of music itself.
Yes.
And this is one thing I share with Jayne Cortez.
Okay. That's why you're so passionate about her work. There are similarities in your approach.
We understood that in the architecture of sound, there was a musical dimension to the oral tradition.
Yes. That was the iconic Linton Kwesi Johnson having a conversation with us and paying us an honorable visit here on Karibu. Thank you very much for joining us, Linton.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.